Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Republicans in the North Carolina General Assembly are trying to hash out a budget that would enable them to manage this fast-growing state while also cutting taxes. To do so, they're looking for cuts throughout state government. One of their targets? The state's public universities. Lawmakers want to free up more than $100 million a year from higher education through cuts and tuition increases. WRAL state government reporter Will Doran has been covering the negotiations, and he joins us now. Will, always good to see you.
You too.
For those of us who don't watch Jones Street as closely as you do, give us a quick overview of where things stand on the state budget, high level.
Yes, both the House and the Senate have approved their own budget plans, and even though the House and the Senate are both run by Republicans, these budget plans are pretty far off. And so we are now in the negotiation phase, which happens just entirely behind closed doors. Really only a handful of key players are even involved in what's going to be going into the final version of the budget. But we do at least have these essentially public statements in the forms of the budget plans that have been approved by each chamber that show what their priorities are and what their priorities are not. One of those big priorities is tax cuts. And again, there's disagreement between the House and the Senate on what exactly that's going to look like, but both of them are suggesting millions of dollars in tax cuts in the future. And so to pay for that, they're going to have to make some cuts to other state government services.
As part of those cuts, they're looking at cutting all kinds of things from the UNC System budget. What are they considering?
Again, lots of disagreement here, but both chambers do agree that higher ed is basically one of their top targets for finding the money that's going to be needed to pay for these tax cuts. And so there are things like both chambers, for instance, propose cutting $7 million worth of vacant positions from the UNC system. So that's jobs that nobody is in right now, nobody's been in for a while, but just make it so that those jobs can't be filled in the future. And that would free up $7 million. They're also targeting, $3 million here, $5 million there in scholarships, in tuition aid programs, things like that. But the really big chunk of money comes from these mandates to slash administrative and even academic programs. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars in cuts to administration and academics.
Now, some university employees say cuts could be hard to find. They're already operating a tight ship. What are we hearing from faculty and administrators?
We are hearing different things. I talked to a professor at the law school at UNC who said that she's worked for 3 public universities, large public universities, at this point in her career, and UNC is by far the most thinly staffed, at least from the administrative perspective. And, people say that, these administrative employees who can be, academic counselors or, Title IX people or regulatory people, there's all sorts of different buckets of administration, but they can help free up professors from having to do administrative work so that they can focus more on actually teaching their classes, meeting with students, things like that. And UNC Chapel Hill itself, which has one of the highest administrator to faculty ratios in the system, actually, when it looks at its other peers, which are, the other kind of flagship public universities in other states, heavily focused on research, it spends less on administration than just about all of them. And so there's a little bit of trepidation that, where do we cut? But at the same time, you also have, from a perspective of the entire university system, the system president, Peter Hans, has said that there are going to be cuts to the administration coming no matter what the legislature orders in the budget. Even if the legislature didn't tell him to cut anything, he wants them to make some cuts anyways. He thinks that the bureaucracy of higher education in North Carolina is too bloated and that actually outcomes will improve and things will be delivered faster, better, if is just a leaner operation going on in the universities.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about how lawmakers think they can bring more money into the state's university system. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran about potential cuts to the UNC system. Will, the state's universities have long been seen as a great value. Why do they have that reputation?
Well, you're right. They are a great value. The U.S. World News Report ranks Chapel Hill as the number one best value public university in the country. And it's had that ranking, I believe, 20 of the last 23 years. I mean, it's just consistently viewed as the best value school in the country. This kind of combination of the quality of the education and the cost that you pay for it. And, UNC is always at least, in the top 5, top 10 of, in terms of overall quality. But then when you factor in how cheap it is compared to these great universities in other states, it winds up as kind of the number one best value pick. And lots of other universities are really great value as well. I mean, there are really quality institutions here in North Carolina of higher education all across the state. And, in part that's because the state government has for a long time put a big emphasis on higher education and, building things like the Research Triangle Park. And, this has led the state to have a reputation for a really good UNC system. And so far, for the last 9 years in a row, the universities have actually managed no tuition increases at all, at least for in-state students.
Now, in addition to the cuts, lawmakers are also looking for ways to bring in more revenue, and it sounds like tuition could be on the table.
Yes. For a while now, like I said, even while they've kept the in-state tuition rate frozen in place for close to a decade, they've been able to afford that by really hiking up tuition on out-of-state students and by doing things like increasing fees that students pay. You don't just pay your tuition, you pay for room and board on campus, or you pay an athletics fee, or you pay a fee for the bus system that the university runs. So they've kind of, been able to keep tuition low by, one, having out-of-state students subsidize it, and two, by having those fees increase. But as they look at these big tax cuts that they're thinking of, nickel and diming people on fees isn't going to cut it. So they are looking at, for the first time, potentially raising tuition on all students, in-state students as well. And again, the plans are a little bit different. The Senate plan actually says don't touch in-state students, only raise it on out-of-state students. The House plan says, kind of look at everybody. So that could be a big sticking point in these budget debates of, who is going to end up paying for this. But they're looking at, $30 to $40 million worth per year of state spending that they could free up with these higher tuition rates.
Now, I would also imagine that there would be some disagreements over what to cut, both at the university level, in the legislature. Everything's negotiable, so what could that look like?
Yeah, it seems like there is pretty broad disagreement that universities are going to lose funding for some vacant positions, for some scholarships. There is agreement on that. That's going to happen. But the bigger pot of money is where there is disagreement, the, 50 to 70 to $80 million worth of cuts, depending on which plan you look at. And in the House, they want to give the university system a lot of flexibility. And that's what Peter Hans, the president, has asked for. That's what, all the leadership of the universities has said. So, okay, we know you want to cut it, but just let us figure out where we want to prioritize things. The Senate wants to be a little bit more micromanagey with it, but they also have a smaller total number of cuts that they're proposing, but they have it very specific, saying, okay, you will cut this amount of money from these programs, you will cut this amount of money from these programs. So not that kind of flexibility. It's much more focused on slashing academic programs, mostly centers and institutes that exist on campuses, and a lot of which are kind of sometimes tend to be for more progressive causes, but can also be completely apolitical. The Lineberger Cancer Center is one of these centers and institutes that might potentially be focused on by these orders. So there's going to be a lot of debate of, okay, not only how much money do we cut, but also how much flexibility do we give the leaders of the UNC system to actually choose how to implement these cuts.
So when will all of this be sorted out? At what point will universities have a clear picture of their finances going forward?
Well, as I think I've made clear, there's a lot of disagreement on this. And this is only one piece of the budget. There are similar disagreements over tons of other things in this budget, state employee raises, Hurricane Helene funding, over how much do we give, what do we focus on. So these budget negotiations are going to drag on for a while. The budget is technically due July 1st. I don't know that there's anyone who follows this thing that expects it to actually be on time. This is going to drag into the summer. And then, of course, for universities, and especially the research-focused universities, the federal government is working on its budget too, and its budget year starts in October. Ours starts at the state level in July. The feds start in October. But universities here in North Carolina get hundreds of millions, maybe close to $2 billion worth of funding from the federal government. And a lot of that is really under the microscope from President Donald Trump. He's already tried cutting much of it and has been stopped due to court cases, including from North Carolina Attorney General Jeff Jackson has filed one of those. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the horizon for universities, both from where they get their money from state taxpayers and from federal taxpayers. But it seems that the general trend is there are going to be cuts. We just don't know exactly how big those cuts are going to be.
Well, we know that you're going to be watching it closely, as always. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL state government reporter Will Doran for his extensive coverage of budget negotiations and cuts of the UNC system. Go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.